Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our Western Australian attendees as well. My name is Simon Croft. I'm HA's Executive Director of Building Policy, and I'll be the main presenter today. I thank you for making time today on this very important matter. And we've got nearly 300 people on the line today from all parts of Australia and all states and territories on the line, which sort of shows the importance of this matter. We've got a number of our committee members, and I welcome all of them across the board and everyone today, so thanks for making time. So we have a packed program for the webinar today that I'll go through. We're going to firstly talk just a little bit about the background to the proposals, the accessible housing proposals, also about what is actually being considered, what's on the table, what the proposed National Construction Code changes could entail, what are some of the key issues that HIA sees with the proposals, something of our own position on the proposals, and then give a little bit of guidance about how to make your own submissions and the timeline for consideration and comment. And as Kerry mentioned, the ability to ask some questions as well, which I'll have some prompts throughout the session. As Kerry also mentioned, today's session will be recorded. I know a number of you have mentioned that your colleagues weren't able to come today, but we're interested in actually getting a recording of the webinar. So that will be up on the website and be sent to you pretty soon after today's presentation. Okay, so we do have a lot to get through, so I will get straight into it. So what is being proposed? The Australian Building Codes Board has released a consultation paper. It's called a Consultation Regulation Impact Statement, or a Consultation RIS, which is looking at the costs associated with introducing mandatory accessible housing features for all new homes and apartments in the next edition of the National Construction Code 2022. If the changes are approved, all new homes, dual occupancies, townhouses, villas, apartments, granny flats and other houses, including extensions, will need to incorporate accessible housing features. The way the proposals are put on the table at the moment, it's not an aggregate approach or a quota approach. It's put up through the National Construction Code, which means it would apply to all new dwellings. The ABCB were requested to do this work by state and territory building and planning ministers through the Building Ministers Forum, and they were asked to use the Livable Housing Design Guides, the silver and gold options as the basis for the consideration, and to undertake a regulatory impact assessment process. The release of the consultation RIS is important to note. This is not a commitment to act, but it is an important decision-making tool in the process of consideration. The release of the RIS follows an options paper in late 2018. Some of you may have already seen that, and we've put in some substantial submissions to that options paper in the past. The documents that have been released for consultation are very complex, I won't lie. If some of you have tried to read through them, the RIS itself is being produced by the Centre for International Economics on behalf of the ABCB, and that contains 290 pages in its own right and is a very detailed document containing quite detailed economic costings and analysis. There's also been a quantity surveyor's report that accompanies the RIS and uses a basis for the costings of the proposals. And the ABCB have also released draft NCC provisions and also an explanatory statement document that goes with it. All in all, about 2,000 pages of documents to try and get your head around. I know I've just been trying to myself, and there's a lot in there. So I'll try and bring it all together a little bit today and what I see as the key sort of issues. So what are the options being considered? The consultation RIS reviews 6 potential accessible housing options. The first 4 options are the mandatory options. Option 1 is about adopting the silver level from the Livable Housing Design Guidelines for all houses and apartments. Option 2 is the gold. Option 3 is gold plus some elements from the platinum, if you know the Livable Housing Design Guidelines. And options 4 would be that it only would apply the gold, but potentially the silver design features for apartments only, and so houses wouldn't be part of it. The other options considered are the non-mandatory options, the enhanced voluntary options that they are called. Option 5 is about subsidies, such as through the National Disability Insurance Scheme, through the Specialist Disability Accommodation, or through the home modifications programs, but also potentially some other tailored support and things like development bonuses, development incentives that could be put on the table rather than making it mandatory. That could increase uptake, but not be done at a mandatory approach. And option 6 is the enhanced voluntary option of turning the livable housing design guidelines into a voluntary ABCB handbook. Part of that thinking is the livable housing design guidelines produced by Livable Housing Australia. Putting it as an ABCB document can increase its profile, with the ABCB now having 250,000 subscribers, trying to increase its profile and reach through that approach, and having it as a single national document as a source of truth where someone seeks to include livable housing features. And it could even team up with those things in option 5 about those subsidies programs. The other part to option 6 is about including a real estate matchmaking service. So something like when you go and purchase a house or when you're doing a rental, when you see how many bathrooms, how many bedrooms, how many showers, and sometimes the energy rating, you could also have features there that might show up on the real estate page about whether this house has accessible housing features and what features it may have. The other part to that option is also about including point of sale information in where people can choose to include some of these features in their homes, about what sort of options they could include, and having that ABCB handbook there as a means of what they could incorporate in at their choosing. So what is accessible livable housing? The provisions are being called accessible housing, but the proposals are really discussion about universal or livable housing rather than wheelchair accessible housing, particularly at the silver level. If you're thinking about accessible from a class 2 to 9 building perspective, or it's not the same side of AS 1428 Part 1 design requirements for wheelchairs. This is about livable, universal, or adaptable housing, and it's designed in approach to about building homes that ensure a home is easy to enter, easy to move around in, easier, more cost-effective to adapt, and more responsive to changing life circumstances. That's what the proposal is about that, essentially livable, universal, or adaptable homes, but they are using the term accessible housing, which they've used throughout the project. So I'll now get into what the actual NCC proposals look like and are being in the draft provisions. And this table here just gives a bit of an overview of what is incorporated in the various elements at the different option 1, option 2, and option 3. I'm predominantly going to talk about the option 1, the silver level option, because option 2 and option 3, unlikely if there is to be a mandatory provisions for those provisions to be, even from the costing, show that they would be substantial costs involved there. So really a lot of the regulatory conversation from what we think is really about either the silver level option 1 or around the non-mandatory approach. So I'm going to specifically talk about the option 1. And the other part just on this one is that for option 1, you're really talking about the entrance to the building, internal doors and corridors, toilets on ground level, bathroom and shower design for easy access, bathroom and toilet walls having the reinforcement for future installation of grab rails, not getting into kitchens or laundries or bedrooms. That's when they trigger into the higher requirements under the gold option or the gold plus option. So I've got on to the provisions now, and these are the provisions that if you've looked at the draft NCC provisions, I've extracted some elements out of them just to try and summarize the provisions. So the first element is about dwelling access, and it talks about a step free from the boundary to the front door. This is probably the most substantial of all the items, and also probably the most controversial of all the items too. So it would require that for a house, and when they talk about houses, but these are the same provisions that apply to apartments, would require a safe continuous path from the boundary to the front door or to an entrance door. It would require that the path have no steps. It also requires that the path would need to be 1 metre wide, have a firm surface. It also prescribes that it must have prescribes a maximum crossfall that is allowable to have. It also then says if and when you need to put a ramp in, the length that the ramp would need to be with landings, and also to require at the start and at the end of the ramp to have 1.2 by 1.2 clear level space on that ramp. So this is quite a substantial requirement, and that's under this step 1. And I've just got a couple of pictures here to sort of give some scenarios about the real difficulty that this one potentially could result in. Here's just some examples I've seen from a new housing estate about how this could actually be done for every single dwelling. Would be extremely difficult about this step 3. Here's another bench site that shows just, a new estate, some of the real challenges that would be presented around this step-free dwelling access requirement. Just a couple more here. This picture now just shows where you might have a split level block as well. A split level on the ground floor, again, would present a real challenge as part of these new requirements as well if they go forward. And here's just another one that would just be extreme to make the requirements apply for these under all circumstances. Under this option, it does provide an alternate to the step 3 from the boundary to the entrance door to allow it that you could do, rather than doing that one, but to go through the garage and having the step 3 through the garage itself. And then also in the provisions has put forward an option 1B. And that option 1B would allow for 1 step. That could either be in the path itself or up at the entrance door to allow 1 step with a maximum of 190. Even with those previous pictures I showed, I think none of those would really be able to still be achieved under those circumstances, even from a relatively flat block as those ones there. It does allow for some minor exemptions from the step-free entrance where there is insufficient space available for a ramp. So where you might have a townhouse that's very close to the front boundary and you wouldn't be able to achieve it in terms of a step-free or a ramp that would be able to meet that grade requirement. It also does provide an exemption from the step-free where the slope of the ground is exceeding 1 in 14, or for garage top dwellings or like a Queenslander or a high set house, but that is only an exemption, as noted on the bottom of the screen there, from the step-free entrance requirements. But once you get in the house, all the other proposed provisions would still need to be met, even though you would give an exemption from the step-free requirement. Okay, moving on to the second element, and this is about dwelling entrance. And now the next provision is about requiring the dwelling entrance door for either the house or the apartment to have a minimum clear opening of 800 mil. This one's been quite, it's gone around a little bit. In the Livable Housing Design Guidelines, it says that it needs to have a minimum clear width of 820, which would mean you'd need to have an 870 door, essentially. But in the draft provisions, it has put forward allowing for a clear width of 800 mil, so therefore would likely allow for an 820 door to be used. The other part to this, that it says that you're allowed to have no more than 5 mil in the lip or the bevel in terms of the transition or the step-free threshold. And then when on the inside area of the door once you enter into the house, it would need to have a 1200 by 1200 mil space on the arrival side of the door, which seems a bit contradictory when we get to the next provision when we talk about widths of hallways. So, sorry, Maya. So just some of those key bits there that I've highlighted on the screen. So the next element is once we're inside the house, it then prescribes requirements about internal doors and corridors. And it will require, for any habitable room, a bathroom, laundry and sanitary compartment on that same level as that entrance level, to have a minimum clear width of 800 mil for the doors, and also it then prescribes a minimum path of travel to be a clear width of a metre. So as you can see, once you get in the dwelling, and particularly for smaller lots and tighter hallways, and building boundary to boundary, some of the implications here for achieving these width requirements would mean that we potentially across the dwelling that you may need to have a wider hallway, which might reduce some of the living spaces or the bedrooms, or alternatively, once you're building in very tight blocks, what we're seeing now at 3.8 and 4.5 metres wide, potentially losing some dwellings out of an allotment where the space requirements would mean that you can't achieve it. It also requires that a toilet must be on the ground or entrance floor, and it also has requirements for the toilet. You've got a couple of different options. You can either have it where you have a toilet that's on its own, such as in a powder room, and you'd need to have a clear width between from the pan of 1200 mil from the swing of the door, and it also needs to be a minimum of 900 mil wide in terms of the width of the toilet, or the sanitary compartment. It also, where you don't choose that option, you can put it as about part of a combined room, but it also then would need to meet, would require that the toilet would need to be in the corner of the room. So it is in a restricted location, so to allow for grab rails and other things. So it is a bit restricting also in terms of some of the design requirements that would come in terms of some of the bathrooms and en suites and other things. For the shower, it doesn't at a silver level prescribe that it needs to be a specific width of shower like it does at the height at other at the gold levels. So it doesn't prescribe a minimum shower width, but it does require that the shower screen must be capable of removal without causing damage to adjoining parts of the shower enclosure. It doesn't give a lot of guidance around in the draft provisions what that specifically means, but it's saying about the shower screen must be capable of removal. And it also is it has, and this is another one that's a bit up for conjecture about having a step-free shower, but it's also now giving a concession to say that you're allowed to have a maximum of 25 mil step up to the shower. But that's been one of those ones that's been conjecture around it, whether it needs to be step-free or allow some sort of lip into the shower where you might have trying to have a step-in shower, but you haven't checked down the slab or the flooring, and therefore you need to meet it through this means. The other part to the provisions around toilets, baths and shower walls is for inclusion of sheeting or noggins to allow for the future installation of grab rails, and it gives quite prescriptive measures around how you need to do the sheeting in the wall, or it does allow for where you've got some types of bricks or other things that are used that they'd be fine for allowing the future installation of grab rails. But yeah, it does provide quite prescriptive requirements about where you need to put the noggins or putting sheeting in the walls as part of that reinforcement. Another provision that's been added has been about access to balconies and outdoor areas. So this would require where you have a balcony on that ground level there, that would allow that one, or the entrance level, that would allow them to go out to the outdoor area, and it'd have to be step-free and have that level threshold again. It does provide an alternate option to allow for that one step of 190 mil, but this is one of those ones that's again a little bit up for conjecture, and also about whether you would need to set in the sill for the window or the door, where it might have, be a stacker or a sliding door or a bifold door where it might have a substantial sill on it, about checking that in to achieve that level step-free. So as I mentioned, all of these provisions do apply both for houses and apartments and for granny flats and for a whole range of different dwellings. So But for apartments, there's also an additional requirement, which is one I wanted to highlight, which will have substantial implications, is that it will require that for each sole occupancy unit to have a car parking space where it has a car parking space for it, for that car parking space for at least one of them to be a minimum of 3.2 by 5.4, which is substantially larger than common car parking for apartments. I think they're around 2.5 or 2.4 by 5.4. So that will have significant implications from a space perspective for apartments, and also where the location, where sometimes in a lot of cases they're built within a three space scenario grid, where you have the columns and you have the transfer beams going in between it. So there'll have to be some reconfiguration and potentially either another floor of car parking to accommodate these sort of changes, or allowing for greater floor areas. Kerry, I might open it up at this time about the draft provisions, if there's any comments just on those ones. I've got more slides to go about the RIS and some other parts to the presentation, but if anyone wants to have any questions that have come through just on the draft provisions, I'm happy to take a few now.
Yeah, I've just sent one through to you in the chat, just so you can have a quick read through that. Or I can read it out to you. Peter's also asked, does the clear width include the skirting and architrave? So for a 900 millimetre clear width, could that mean an actual width of 230 millimetre?
Yeah, it's a good question. It hasn't been clarified in the draft provisions at this time. It talks about a clear width. I would suspect that the clear width would allow for some minor elements such as skirting boards to encroach into that space, provided there are very minor elements such as 19 mil skirting on either side, but having a clear width between the walls in the corridor itself to achieve that 1 metre. Hopefully I answered your question there, Peter.
Yeah, Ken also made a point around the step-free balconies and the issue with waterproofing.
Yeah, this is a key thing, is there's a lot of competing NCC requirements here, both from a waterproofing and termite perspective when you're talking about step-free entries. And this is something that the provisions haven't solved. All they've just said is take consideration of, which really doesn't provide anyone with any certainty on this. And we know that water ingress is a substantial issue, and benchmarking and lowering sites down, and it's sort of about as such competing requirements around the code, where we already are supposed to have steps away from buildings and falls away from buildings to stop water ingress. So potentially causing another issue here in terms of these provisions.
Okay, and Kerry has said, it's my understanding that outdoor balconies are supposed to be set down lower than the main floor level.
Yeah, there is a couple of different options in how you can do it, but most of the time, yes, they are required to have a step down, and then you have your external waterproofing and you have your upturn requirements. But there are some options in the waterproofing standard for level thresholds, but they're not exhaustive. And really, if they do proceed with these provisions, I think we will need solutions in the code about how we meet these competing requirements, and not just saying subjective provisions to say, take consideration of.
Okay, and did you see that message, that question from Debbie, or I'll read it out to you if you like?
Yeah, you can read it out. Yep.
Okay, what about exemptions where a plan of development might condition the design of dwellings as having to have elevated entry? We have that situation in an area on the Sunshine Coast, and it's an architectural feature that's prescribed in the plan of development.
Yeah, it's a very good question. There's no room at the moment for dispensations or exemptions. This is one of the issues with putting it into the National Construction Code. It either applies 100% or it doesn't. Where it's applied potentially through planning legislation, it can give some more subjectivity and be tailored to specific blocks. Whereas through the NCC, it's either in or it's out. It does have those minor exemptions that I mentioned, but that was only from the step-free entrance requirements. So, you know, what other mechanisms would need to be set up about dispensations or these sort of things. I think they would all need to be serious considerations that would need to take a part of it.
There's actually a fair few questions coming through, Simon, so perhaps we might get to those ones. We might have to come back to those at the end if you like, and if you want to keep moving.
I could probably take two more, Kerry, and then I can run, and then we can go through the rest of it if that's okay.
Okay, so if Christine said if the slope of the block is greater than 1 to 14, a step is allowed. That's her question.
So if there's probably two parts to that question. One, that there's an option 1A, they call it, and the option 1A is step free. Then there's option 1B. 1B allows for one step for a maximum of 190 mil for that one step. There's also then the exemptions for those 3 times that I mentioned where the block might be steeper than 1 in 14, or where you know, it's a high set house or something like, or the other ones that I mentioned, the insufficient space. Where you get that exemption, it then you would allowed to have a number of steps under those circumstances, then it would be assumed. But then you would still, once you're inside the dwelling, need to meet the rest of the requirements. If that answered that question.
Okay, and Vicky has said, I may have missed this one, but are these proposals going to be universally applied across all homes or just where accessible housing requirements are nominated?
No, so the proposal is that it apply to all new homes in the National Construction Code 2022, and that would include apartments, houses, granny flats, duplexes, knockdown rebuilds, all manner of housing. There's no exemptions or quotas or aggregated approach. It would apply 100%. Is what is proposed.
Okay.
Okay, that might be a good segue, Kerry, to move into the next bit. Next bit of the presentation, and I can take more questions at the next pause after I go through these next set of slides. So hopefully, might answer a few more questions. Okay, I'll just try and close that one down. No. Okay, sorry. Okay. Moving on to the next part of the presentation, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the RIS itself. So the RIS, as I mentioned at the outset, has been produced by the Centre for International Economics on behalf of the ABCB, and then it also has an accompanying quantity surveyor's report. I'll just give some core components of that RIS. Okay, so what the cost benefit analysis that's in the RIS is got a number of components to it. Firstly, what it's trying to do is establish the starting point. What is the cost and benefit? What is the problem that's seeking to be solved? That's what a lot of the commentary in the RIS is about. What's the problem? That's what a RIS, and these RISs that the ABCB undertake have some guidelines that they have to follow based on the government requirements for RISs. And the first bit is, what would the cost of moving to mandatory provisions for all housings look like? What would it cost? What would be the impacts? The second part also is what are the benefits? Because obviously if you have the cost, you have to have the benefits to offset it, and to have, you know, try and reach somewhere in the middle or have a benefit out of it that would outweigh the costs. This is a very, very difficult issue. It's not like trying to make an assessment on should the waterproofing be applied to the whole bathroom or only in the shower area. This is a area where we're talking a majority of about societal type issues, and also things like equitable and dignified, reduced time in hospitals, being able to age in place, and these types of things, which are really difficult things to both put a number on in terms of a benefit number, but from also applying it, and it goes very much to that last question that we just had about the cost, about trying to work out what it would cost for, you know, one house that might be on the level block. It might be a lot easier compared to some of those pictures I showed before, which would be extremely difficult to achieve. So trying to get an average cost is also a really difficult part to this, and trying to have a cost that would be universally applicable to try and have a fair estimate for ministers to make a decision on the costs and benefits. So the benefits that are listed in the RIS about moving to an accessible housing standard as a mandatory thing would include societal type issues such as reduced falls, reduced time in hospital, reduced costs associated with loneliness, and those other items that are mentioned there on the screen. The RIS says that roughly 38% of the benefits are societal benefits, which are derived from a survey and some work that they've done in their modelling and analysis that suggests there is a willingness to pay in the community. So the costs, what's included in the costs? What they've listed down is about additional training and education for changing construction standards. There would be the need for changes to home designs. There'd be changes to material and construction costs, and also some opportunity cost or loss of space. So loss of space within the individual dwelling, and it does also put a little bit of information around what it might be where you might lose one or two houses in a new housing estate over a row where you've got some townhouses or row houses. Very limited around that though. So roughly, here's some of the costs that the RIS has put forward in terms of a weighted average cost. And a weighted average cost, they talk about from a low, medium or high impact, and try and get somewhere in the middle, saying, roughly there might be 20% say in the low, there might be 40% in the high, and 60% in the middle, trying to do an average weighted approach to the costings across the various options. Across the options, they look at 3 different types of dwelling types: a separate house, a townhouse, an apartment, and they put the costs against an estimated construction cost per dwelling, an opportunity cost of space, and then that total dwelling price. I know people that are looking on the screen there is probably at that silver level. They're saying no way, it would be substantially greater than that, particularly for the majority of the scenarios, rather than some that have already got a very nice level block where it might be easier. But even from those perspectives, there are other design implications there, and also about changing of the standard form designs and things like this. But this is the costs that have been put forward in the RIS by the quantity surveyors. But there's some issues there, what I'll talk to on the next slide. As I mentioned at the start about option 2 and option 3, the gold and the gold plus options, you can note there that the costs are being indicated are substantial, and hence why I mentioned before that it's unlikely in a future regulatory conversation that the gold and the gold plus options will really be part of the consideration. It'll really probably most likely be around this silver option. So the cost, what hasn't been included? It hasn't really done any reduction in the number of lots in a residential development, which everyone on the line here would likely know that would be a substantial implication. There's no costs really been attributed for the additional excavation costs that we were required to enable the dwelling to meet the entrance egress requirements. HIA has put forward, and it's listed in the RIS, that the costs for excavation are likely to be extreme. And we've put forward some numbers which are probably conservative, to be totally honest, around the $2,600 per dwelling to be able to achieve the requirements from an excavation perspective. But they actually haven't been accounted for in the RIS at the moment. They're just noted in the RIS. So if you're thinking about putting in a submission, something I'd focus your attention on. It hasn't really taken much of account of those issues that are going to come for the impact for car parking for apartments and the redesign and the additional space requirements and changing the, going from going to a 3.2 metre wide car parking space in an apartment is going to have significant implications for each SOU, each apartment across the whole dwelling block, the apartment block, sorry, and also about the changing construction detail, the additional excavation or levels that will be required there. And we have been talking to some developers in the apartment space, and some of those numbers are much much more substantial than has been attributed in the RIS. It makes lots of assumptions in the quantity surveyor's work about that, you know, all houses already have a 900 mil path up to the dwelling door, so just making it into a metre won't have any real implications. There's a whole range of those types of assumptions that have been made in the costings, and therefore, you know, to see those low numbers that have been produced there, that lots of these things are being called status quo, which is just not true. And it also assumes that access to the front door and to balconies have no more than one step, and, you know, across the board has very conservative costings used. The other really notable part is that it's also taken the assumption of option 1B being potentially the accepted option, which allows for that one step, and that's saying that majority of all houses already have just one step, so that will have no impact, so it's no cost in terms of the dwelling entrance requirements, which is a substantial thing to make that call, because it has significant implications on the cost benefit analysis, as well as that excavation cost that I mentioned before. So in terms of the outcome, in terms of the holistic cost benefit analysis, it has come up that there would be, it used two different models about those benefits approach. It used a problem reduction approach and a willingness to pay approach. They're very complicated ways and means of doing it, but essentially the end number was that the construction costs would outweigh the benefits, but it was only marginal from their perspective when you're talking, you know, in the $800 million versus sort of an offset type of thing that seems to get closer to the baseline. If they went down the weighted, the willingness to pay approach, then the numbers were saying that there'd be a lot more people willingness to pay, homeowners willing to pay to conclude these features, so the benefits would outweigh the costs under that scenario. But they also noted that doing surveys and willingness to pay type surveys are not a real core indicator. The problem reduction approach, which is more a research analysis approach, is more substantial way to analyze it. So the RIS doesn't provide a recommended option, but it does have these following quotes, which I'll read out because they're quite substantial quotes. It says, based on the preliminary evidence gathered for the consultation RIS, the costs associated with including accessible housing standard in the NCC are estimated to outweigh the benefits under the central estimates for all the options tested. It also then goes on to say that the enhanced voluntary approach could be included in a non-monetary handbook at minimal cost, together with some relatively low-cost measures to overcome barriers to uptake of universal design principles, and this could encourage additional uptake with lower risk of imposing excessive costs on new dwellings, which we would concur with both those statements. So in terms of the accessible housing proposals, so what is HA's position on the mandatory provisions, and will HA be submitting in response to the RIS? So I've just got some key comments that I've put forward that will be in terms of forming our response. These are the types of items that we will be raising. That HA does not support mandatory accessible housing provisions, and we'll be supporting the enhanced voluntary option 6 in combination with subsidies and bonuses under that option 5. We're putting forward some more items around what could be done as part of that enhanced voluntary option as well. The step-free path impacts will be significant, even with permitting a single step, and will mean numerous blocks will not be able to comply. The mandatory provisions would significantly impact the viability of a range of housing developments and exclude a range of housing designs and internal building layouts and design options. So it went to one of those questions that we had about the architectural features in one of the earlier questions. The excavation costs that HA has put forward in the RIS, though noting the RIS does not account for these in the actual costings, are realistic examples and likely to be conservative examples, if anything, and could be easily doubled for many blocks. And they need to be costed as part of any final RIS in the decision-making process. The provisions will not only affect new volume build homes, where a lot of the commentary's been around, but will affect knockdown rebuilds, new builds in metropolitan areas, housed in regional, rural and coastal towns, walk-up apartments and other apartments, studio dwellings, secondary dwellings, granny flats. It will affect all of them in some way, shape or form. It's not just a volume build issue, as has been made out by some of the commentary around this. The impacts of the changes for apartments, including car parking spaces and internal layout, are significant and will add substantive cost to a project, including for construction systems, space, excavations, and these impacts have not been properly taken account of and need to be. Any new mandatory provisions cannot and should not apply to 100% of dwellings, and therefore provisions should not be prescribed through the NCC if there are two mandatory provisions, and a range of building types should be exempted from the provisions outright. There's also a range of other associated impacts with mandating accessible livable housing features for all new homes that have not been taken account of in the RIS, including changes to standard form designs, changes to subdivisions and display home requirements, additional certification and approval requirements, just to name a few. And just lastly, the step-free entrance requirements will impact the choice of structural floor systems that can be used, essentially meaning that any raised floor or waffle pod system will find compliance extremely difficult to comply. So there's just some of the core things that we'll be raising in our submission back to the ABCB and to governments on this matter. And here's just a couple of, a few more examples of housing choices that will be, mean that their viability going forward will be extremely hampered. Here's a Highset house out of Northern Territory, award-winning home. And here's another one that you would say that's potentially on a fairly flat block, but again, this is in a bushfire-prone area, which you're trying to have it higher off the ground as well. So you're not going to have the build-up and have, timbers and other materials in close contact with the ground. And this just shows that even for what they call a level block, a level block is not a level block, as you can see here. And to the dwelling entrance door, that's at least 4 steps. And even the subjectivity around what is considered the site boundary will be something that will come up, I think, quite often. So, talked about some of the things today, and now just a little bit about how can you give feedback. And we've really been encouraging people who are interested in this topic to put your own submission in and not just rely on HA. And how do you do that? Submissions are due back by close of business by the 31st of August, and we've been encouraging our members to make their own submissions. You can provide feedback by either completing the online form, which the ABCB are using a thing called a consultation hub, which is on the ABCB's website, very easy to find, and answering the questions outlined. Or you can provide a submission directly to the ABCB at their abcbris@abcb.gov.au email box. But you also need to ensure in doing that you fill out the information collection and personal information form that's on the website there. So that's essentially the majority of my presentation today. I have one more slide after this, but I'm happy to take more questions, Kerry. So I'm happy to open it up. We've probably got about 10, 15 minutes left, so happy to as many as I can.
Okay, Kerry asked, did you mention that the proposed changes will apply to the renovation or extension of existing homes? It would seem pretty obvious that much of the infrastructure of an existing home could not be upgraded to the proposed changes.
So thanks, Kerry, for that question. It's a really good one. There's no exemptions listed at the moment that would exclude it from applying to extensions. It wouldn't, unlikely to, and as logical as my response to that one is, that you probably, there's no trigger for the renovation, the part that's not being worked on, in the renovated parts of the existing part of the dwelling, to come up to current standards, unless it gets triggered. But there's no exemption from the extension that wouldn't need to meet these requirements. So essentially, yes, extensions would need to meet the requirements even though you may not need to update the front half of the house unless it's triggered and you're going over a certain floor area of the requirements. We've been saying that extensions and renovations just completely need to be exempt from the requirements. They shouldn't be captured as part of it, just for the exact reason that you pointed out in your question. But it hasn't been exempted at this stage.
Okay, Trish has said in the 2018 papers, there was no discussion or mention of changes to the car parking in apartments. The changes to the car parking was a surprise, and I would think that is the reason no costings were undertaken.
Yep, Trish, it was a surprise to us. I don't know if they've got, I think there's been some confusion around that requirement. It's never been part of the Livable Housing Design Guide requirements about car parking in apartments. Where state governments, in Victoria, for example, under their Better Design Apartments Guide, it has a 50% of apartments need to meet a requirement, but has nothing around car parking. I think that one's going to be, they do have some costing for it, but the costings are nowhere near adequate for what it would mean for car parking for apartments. I think that one is something that's going to, I've not seen it before in the provisions. A lot of people have talked about houses throughout this whole thing, but really haven't focused that much on apartments. Hence why we've highlighted that area, and we'll be putting some submissions in around that thing on apartments and car parking.
Okay, actually, I've got a couple of questions around car parking. So Don asked, how does this apply to automated car parking systems?
Kerry, it might be for that one. I don't know specifically the question there really from Don on that one, and maybe we could take that one offline and just have a chat on it. So just so I can get a bit more information about the type of question that from an automated car parking perspective.
Sure. Debbie said the required width of a car park for a person with a disability is currently 4 metres, effectively a double car park, and typically one space in a multiple unit development would meet that requirement. Will that tick the box?
No, it's a simple answer. It will require that it will require a 3.2 by 5.4 car park for apartments for each. For one car park associated to each apartment itself. So it can't be combined type of thing. It needs to be one for each dedicated apartment, the way the provisions are drafted. For houses, there's no requirement to have the accessible car park requirement or having a car park, unless you choose to use, you don't go and use the step-free entrance requirements, and you end up instead using the garage as your step-free entrance. In that case, you would need to have your car park, your garage or your car spot there would need to be 3.2 by 5.4 under those circumstances.
Okay, Rebecca has asked, how would a house in a flood-prone area that is required to have a minimum floor level be able to adhere to the step-free entrance? This hasn't been listed as an exemption.
Yeah, it is one of, I did mention it in general context that it is one of the ones that is exempted. It's under, I mentioned that it's a high set house, so it does provide an exemption for a house that would be listed in a defined flood zone or something to those effects. So it is one of those ones that is exempted under the provisions from providing the step free.
Jack's asked, can you please explain silver, gold and gold plus?
Okay. Yeah, so we have been through them in the earlier slides, but the silver incorporates 7 core design elements, which are those ones that I ran through in the slide, being the step-free entrance, having the wider, having the clear opening on the front door, the wider internal corridors and doors, having the toilet on the ground floor, and having the walls ability to have it reinforced to have the future installation of grab rails. Once you go down the next one into gold and gold plus or platinum, it incorporates a range of different additional elements there that go more to really after silver, Gold and Gold Plus go to essentially more wheelchair accessible dwellings, where Silver is really about that adaptable, livable, universal type of dwelling. In Gold and Gold Plus, it also brings in spaces, circulation spaces in bedrooms, in laundries and in kitchens, and also starts to get more prescriptive in terms of width of showers. It has additional widths of doorways, also additional paths of travel requirements in terms of widths. So it goes up in stringency essentially.
Okay, Anita's asked, would HIA consider naming organisations or practices to be co-signatories or names included in response back to the ABCB?
It's probably one we might have to take offline, that question, Kerry. We usually try and ensure that we do our own submissions and also then encourage others to do the submissions, particularly on a subject such as this, where we don't want people just to, and governments just to take it all as one submission, or to have templates and things like this, where they'll just see it as one submission. We want to see it as a range of submissions from everyone to try and show about the, because earlier in the options paper, there was only there was 179 submissions and only 5 were from building industry groups. And the rest were from people who are advocates for pushing lots of these requirements. So we really are encouraging our members to put the submissions in, and really would encourage probably individual submissions and individual company submissions, rather than just having joint and co-signatory submissions. But we certainly can have that conversation offline.
Okay, Andrew has said, Simon, great presentation. All things being equal, in your opinion, what's the likelihood of these changes to be implemented in some way, shape or form?
It's a very good question. And governments do seem very keen on this one. There's a number of state governments that are pushing this one pretty hard. A number of them have had go in the past. Victoria had a go in the past. Queensland's had a go in the past. ACT's had a go in the past. Really, as I mentioned, I think that Silver, but with the one step, seems like that's really where the ABCB's positioning around this could be. Whether, I think there's really probably a couple of potential options. It could be implemented in the code with a very long transition period. The other one would be this enhanced voluntary, but with a real commitment to, and additional things. There might be mandatory disclosure that goes with it, and a few other things that would tack on. So it's not just going to be publish it as an ABCB handbook and everybody thinks that it's achieved the goal. It needs to be a true and meaningful thing. If it is to be enhanced voluntary, that ministers are then be able to say, okay, this is a true option. This is not just kicking it down the road for an extra 3 years. So I think we've certainly got our work cut out. The draft provisions are a long way developed. This consultation RIS is a really key part of it. And it probably leads to my next slide, Kerry, and we're probably getting towards the end, is what happens next. And it's sort of one of the things, so I'll work through this one. In 2017, ABCB were directed by building ministers to start the process. In 2018, the ABCB released their options paper. 2019, that they started the RIS work and produced the RIS. 2020, where we are now, the RIS has been developed, and so consultation is out for 8 weeks, public consultation. They will then be producing a final RIS that's going to go back to building ministers for a decision of whether that work will proceed to the next part. And I think that's the really key part. And that's something that we've been pushing for HIA, to ensure that the next part to this process is going back to building ministers and saying, this is the feedback that's been received. Should this proceed further? Do you want us to proceed further? Should we be doing something else? Should we be looking at other options? You know, is the NCC the right vehicle? Should this be looked at in terms of doing it through other mechanisms, such as through planning, where you could be a bit more like a designated, like a bushfire approach, where you develop up a standard, and then once you're in a designated area, then the provisions would apply, you know, where it's a very, you know, rather than being 100% application across the board. So that decision will be done by building ministers later in this year as to whether they want to keep proceeding with the work, if they say yes, the next step in the process will be that the provisions will be included in the public comment draft of NCC 2022, which will be then another round of consultation. The purpose that we really wanted to go back to building ministers is once it gets into a public comment draft, it's very, very hard from that stage is to get something out once it's in there. So a decision after the RIS this time round to say whether they want to keep proceeding is really important. I think once it gets into the public comment draft, it'll be really, it gets a lot harder to stop it from going into the code. So it's then probably moving around the goalposts about how far it goes and what other exemptions would apply and whether the provisions are exactly right. But that doesn't mean it's completely off the table. And then following the public comment draft, the Australian Building Codes Board will need to make a decision about whether they're going to be recommending to building ministers for this to be mandated, and then the discussion, then we'll go back to building ministers for final sign off, and then that probably part of that might be the discussion around transition periods and things like this, or whether there needs to be other exemptions as well. So there still is a few decision points in the process, but this consultation is a really important part in the process as I've articulated. Okay, Kerry, I think we're at 2 o'clock now. I'm sure that some people might have some more questions, and I know, please feel free as part of the survey responses. If you have other questions or if you've typed them away, we'll endeavour to get back to you with your questions. Otherwise, most of you are members or you're part of our committees around the country. Feel free to contact us if you want to have a chat. We'd welcome any of your feedback to inform our submission. But again, I'd really encourage you all, if you've got an interest in this, which you obviously do, as being part of this seminar today, encourage you to be putting in your own submissions as well. So thank you for your time today in these quite challenging circumstances. I hope you got something out of the presentation. As Kerry mentioned, we'll take a recording of this and you can share it with your colleagues, and will be sent around to you. But I thank you and hope you got something out of it today. Thanks, Kerry.
Thanks, Simon. And I'll just let everyone know who have typed in questions. If we hadn't got to your question, I have captured those. And so, as Simon said, we'll get back to you individually as soon as we can, just to answer those questions for you. Simon, a question, will the slides be available?
We'll do the slides as part of the recording, Kerry. So
okay.
Hopefully some of that stuff might be able to help you if you are making your own submission. Some of those points that HA has identified might be able to help you with some of your thinking around this as well.
That's great. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us today. As Simon mentioned, please, if you do have any other feedback or questions, put them in the survey. If you've already typed in a question, I have captured those and we can get back to you. And I will be sending out an email to you individually when the recording is available, and we'll have the slides saved there as well. So thank you once again. Thank you, Simon, and thank you to all of our members for joining today.